Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. For animal biology today, we're going to talk about the phylum Annelida, or annelids, and we're going to talk about the class Polychaeta. Okay, the polychaetes are a marine group of worms, which are often called the marine worms, and they're different than other annelids in that they have these parapoda, these limb-like structures that come off of each segment. Okay. Now the difference is they can be like feathery like this, or they can just be projections that kind of look like walking legs in this form. And we'll come back and we'll talk about those. Okay, but remember we're moving from mollusca, the phylum Mollusca, into the phylum Annelida. Okay, and we're still under Lophotrichozoans. We're still talking about Lophotrichozoans, but now we're talking about a group in the phyla Annelid, which have distinguishing features and are much more advanced than some of the previous groups that we're talking about, like Gastrica, Nermerta, things like that. Annelids are triploblastic coelomates, okay? And you start to see that they have distinct body regions. So they have segments in which their body is divided. Okay? We'll come back. We'll talk more about how and what that allows the organism to do. Okay? So from an evolutionary perspective, like I said before, they are segmented, so they are metamertic. Okay, so in other words, they have connective tissue that can create compartments. They are bilaterally symmetrical, okay, as all Lophotrichozoans are, and they are worm-like, or they're worms. They have a unique kind of development. They're proteostomes, so they have spiral cleavage, but they have trochophora larvae. Well, majority of them have trochophora larvae. Some of them have direct development, okay? But they have that formation of a column, okay? And now it's sclerous, in which it has connective tissue to form the column. We're going to look at this in a little bit, okay? But nonetheless, these are true coelomates, true column formers, okay? They have epidermal setae, okay, which are kind of small projections which allow for them to move throughout either the water column or move throughout a terrestrial environment. Okay? And some of them it's secondarily lost, so some of them don't have it. Okay? It's a closed circulatory system, so the whole group, okay, has a closed circulatory system. Okay? So when we were talking about mollusks, only one group in the molluscan phylum, okay, and that was the cephalopods, have a closed circulatory system. Now in the annelid phyla, all of them do. Okay, so we're becoming more advanced in that perspective. Okay, and you're also starting to see more advancement in the nervous system, okay, with a suprapharyngeal ganglion. So in other words, a brain. Okay, so one control center. Now some organisms will have one control center and then a bunch of segmental ganglia or ventral ganglia, which would occur throughout the entire organism's body. Okay? And we'll look at some of these examples. Okay? The kidney system, or the nephrida system, is it's diversifying. It's either a metanephrida or a protonephrida, and so this will just the internal structure of the nephrida cells. They just differ a little bit. In some cases, the actual formation is a little bit different. Okay? The premise and the purpose is the exact same, for filtration, to act like a kidney. Okay, but the actual design structure, okay, is a little bit different. The evolution of those cells have differed a little bit depending on the organism we're talking about. We'll come back to this in a second. Okay. So how are they related? Again, they're lophotrichozoans. Okay. Now, we start to see quite a few features in annelids that we'll see again in arthropoda, okay, the insects. But most of the features that we see in annelids and the insects that are similar is probably through convergent evolution. Okay, so they converged on a similar body type because they're in a similar region or similar habitat or similar feeding process, etc. Okay, metamerism, this connective tissue formation and this outer tissue and the segments of the organism is probably a good example of that convergent evolution. Arthropods evolved from organisms that didn't have it and converged on the same body formation that annelids did. Okay. Now, the classification here is interesting to say the least. It's being worked on by some researchers out there. It will be changing in the near future. Okay, in the next 5 years or so, we'll have a better understanding of the evolution of annelids. But classifying organisms in annelids has kind of proven difficult, and they're often classified based on maybe a single morphological feature, whether or not they have parapods or not. This is difficult to say the least. So you're probably going to see in the future that annelids gets kind of a makeover in classification because the evolution is really poorly understood right now because we don't have enough information. Okay, so they belong to Lophotrichozoa, another branch of the Lophotrichozoans, along with the branch that holds the molluscans, the branch that holds Platyhelminthes, Nemerta, Acoelomorpha. All these guys fall under Lophotrichozoan. Very different organisms, very strange, but you'll see that when it comes to separating Lophotrichozoans versus echidozans and Deuteostroma, they're different from each other. So metamerism and tagmatization, okay, this is that ability to compartmentalize or segment the body, okay? And so you start to get these segments. You get digestive system in one region, you get reproductive system in another region, respiratory system in another region, nervous system, etc. So it really allows for the body to be arranged in segmental parts. Okay? That allows for a lot of things. Okay? So once the columns and the compartments have been developed, okay, then you have the capability of doing quite a few things. You can close them off. So if one region is damaged, say you damage the digestive gland, okay, you can close off or segment or close off that region, that column, so digestive juices don't leak out through the entire body and destroy the individual. If it's a reproductive season, you can close it off so your gonads aren't floating throughout the system. They're kept within the same region or in one region, in the clitellum region, okay, in certain organisms. Okay, so you can lessen lots of things. You can lessen the impact of injury. Okay, you can specialize body regions. You can form a hydrostatic compartments for help with locomotion and protection. There's lots of things that are going on by being able to separate each segment of the body independent. Okay, so we're moving, and we talked about this before. We were talking about acoelomates, so we're talking about Acoelomorpha, Platyhelminthes, okay, where they have this ectodermis, mesodermis, endodermis, no compartments, no columns formed. Then we started talking about organisms that were a little bit more advanced, okay, things like gastropods and molluscans, which have a column, but maybe it's incomplete column, either only forms in one region, maybe in the mantle cavity around the heart or something like that. Okay, and there's no septum, there's no separation of those columns. It's kind of just an open region. Okay, all the way to coelomates, true coelomates, which have this, septum. It has mesentery, which can encase the endoderm, so you can get muscular, digestive tract, lots of things can go on, and you can have these open spaces which can help with exchange of gas material, exchange of nutrients, housing of reproductive parts, blood flow. All kinds of things can go on when you're talking about coelomates, true coelomates. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the class Polychaetae. Okay, so the polychaetes are marine for the most part. There are a couple freshwater species. Okay, they're a huge group, very large. They have external structures, parapods, which they use for locomotion. Okay, so we're going to talk about movement, muscle movement, because before, when we talked about muscle movement, we were talking about molluscans. We talked about muscle movement and their muscles moving in waves. Polychaetes, annelids, okay, that group, that phyla, their muscles do not have to move in waves because they have stigmatization, and so they have these compartments, so they can fire muscles independent. They can fire muscles on one side of their body and then muscles on the other side of their body at the same time. So they can contract those muscles and then relax the muscles in between, so they can undulate through the water column or through the soil, etc. Okay? So those parapoda, in the case of polychaetes, okay, are these extensions, these limb-like structures, okay, lateral extensions that will be tipped with setae, okay, so hair-like structures which allow for them to move throughout the water column more freely, I guess you could say. Prostotum is kind of like a proboscis that comes off the mouth. It's not to the degree of things like Nemerta, the proboscis worms. It's often not even associated with feeding, but rather it's associated with sensory. So the prostotum can have eyes off of it. It can have kind of sensory tentacles that come off of it. It can be associated with feeding. It just depends on the organism in question. Okay, the peristernum. Okay, this is kind of another segment that encases the mouth of the organism. And you can think of this as kind of like the precursor to a jaw. Okay, so we're starting to get, at least in the head region of the organism, you're starting to get sensory definition. Okay, so you're going to get sensory separation. You're going to get suprapharyngeal ganglia. The brain is starting to form, and you're starting to get this diversification in the head region, including the mouthpieces and things like that. And like I said before, we're going to talk about crawling or swimming using the parapoda, okay, and the distinct muscle movements. Okay? So here you can see parapoda, setae, associated with the parapoda. They can come in 2s, 3s, 4s, doesn't really matter. But they're just, the parapoda are tipped with these setae, these long kind of extensions. But the important piece here that I want to talk about is, instead of moving your muscles or firing your muscles in waves like a gastropod does, okay, the polychaetes and the annelids have this ability to fire muscles on each side of their body independent, okay, because the body is divided in segments. So you might have, these muscles here contracted and these muscles over here contracted, while the rest of the muscles are relaxed, okay, which will cause the organism to snake or undulate through the water column or through the soil, the sediment, whatever it might be. The faster or the more muscles you fire on each side, the different motion you can get. You can get a swimming motion, you can get a crawling motion, You can get kind of a walking motion, which would look like they're traveling in just a straight line if they're firing lots of segments on each side at the same time. Feeding and digestion, we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about molluscans and kind of mollusca giving rise to other organisms or a different kind of digestive system. We see in annelids, their digestive system is much more advanced than in mollusks. Okay? So there is a straight kind of tube going from the mouth to the anus, but with it you get kind of this diversification of body parts. Okay? The proboscis itself can be used as a feeding projection, so it can be extended, it can be inverted. There's lots of situations, it just depends on the organism. Most of Polychaetae are predators, okay, but you can have lots of, I mean, they're a very diverse group, there's lots of them, it's very species rich, so depending on what environment they live in, they can have different types of food resources, and that would decide, well, what use is your proboscis? Are you consuming things? Do you have to move the proboscis out to capture prey? Is it going to be kind of used to filter feed? What's going on with that organism? Okay? But that distinction that we need to make between mollusks and annelids is now you start to see in the digestive system, probably due to the evolution of compartments. You have these distinct regions now and distinct features, okay, of the digestive system. You have a crop, a gizzard, okay, sometimes the upper portion of the intestine, a stomach, and then the intestines. And each region has these purposes, distinct purposes. So they've been specialized to have a certain job, you could say. Okay? So the crop, it's initial to grind up food. A lot of times in the crop of annelids, you'll find small pebbles and rocks, sand, that kind of stuff, used to grind up different food sources. Gizzard, okay, often, this is very important for digestive glands, so you can have these glands that are excreting digestive enzymes. A stomach, if it's available, will churn those enzymes and help with digestion. And intestines, of course, they're going to be extracting the nutrients from the food bolus. Okay? So that digestive system is now compartmentalized, so you have different regions doing different jobs. In gas exchange, okay, the gas exchange for polychaetes is across the ectodermis, okay, across the outside body wall is how they diffuse. So they occur in aquatic environments and they diffuse oxygen across that membrane. But the way that this works and the nice, from an evolutionary point of view, the increase in the closed circulatory system or the development of a closed circulatory system allows for that diffusion to work better. So they have not only veins and arteries, but they have capillary beds, and these capillary beds will extend out to the tips of the parapoda. And because you're exchanging gas across the membrane, having those capillary beds close to the membrane surface, okay, will allow for that exchange, that gas exchange, to occur more readily. Okay? With that, you can also feed those parapoda oxygenated blood, you can feed them nutrients, etc. So you have a very different kind of system than what we've seen before in mollusca. Okay, so here you can see you got these blood vessels, you got these capillaries associated with the nutrition coming off the intestines or the gut. You have these parapodial capillaries, which will help with absorption of oxygen and displacing carbon dioxide out of the body. Okay, these help with nutrients. This help them with oxygen conversion or capturing. Okay, and you kind of got a much better system. On top of it, you have, most of the time, you have multiple hearts. Okay? Now, when I say multiple hearts, they are called hearts because they're distinguished entities. They're separate entities. But it's really like looking at multiple chambers. Okay? The purpose is to pump and flush, pump and flush, pump and flush. Okay? It's not like one heart is controlling one part of the body and the other heart's controlling the other part of the body. The hearts are used in unison to pump the blood throughout the organism's body. The nerve system is a double nerve cord and has segmental ganglia. So ganglia that occurs at each segment throughout the body. So they have a suprapharyngeal ganglia, a brain, and then they have these subganglia or segmental ganglia that occur at each segment of the body. But the nerve cord itself is the fusion of two nerve cords. It's bilobed or it's double. Okay? And it also has some other unique features. Okay? So again, like I said, the segmental ganglia, just like we talked about before when we were talking about other organisms that can move through a water column and have these ganglia that occur in regions of their body, the segmental ganglia coordinate individual movement within the segments. So they can isolate segments and they can fire just muscles within that region, or they react to stimuli just in that one region. Okay? They also have giant fibers, nerve fibers, okay, it's part of the nerve cord. They have these giant fibers that run throughout the entire organism's body, and it has this ability to react extremely fast to stimuli, okay, and that probably allows for escape responses and things like that. Okay, so here you can see the setup. It's a little bit different than other organisms, but has a lot of similarities still. Okay, so that suprapharyngeal ganglion, okay, or the brain, okay, controlling the head of the organism. It has eyes associated with it. It has tentacles associated with it. Sensory projections associated with it. This is controlling most of the sensory, the statocysts, etc., in this region of the organism. So it controls balance, sensing, okay, that kind of stuff, mouth, that region. The rest of the ganglia, okay, will occur at each segment, okay, and it will control the parapods within that segment. Okay. You can see this double nerve cord, or bilobe nerve cord with these giant fibers associated with it, okay, helping with mediate fast response. Okay, so they have eyes. At least Polychaetae do. Not all annelids have eyes, but polychaetes have eyes, and that comes off the proboscis or the peristernum, the edge or the tip of the head of the organism. They also have what we call a nucleus organ, okay, and this has to do with chemoreceptors. So now you have this organism that has the ability to taste, and so they have the ability to taste chemicals and sensory, and probably gave rise to things like antennae or similar structures that we see in arthropods later on. But the chemoreceptors are the nuclear organs, okay, in the head, controlled by the suprapharyngeal ganglia. Like I said before, they also have a statocyst in the head, okay, and so this is kind of like an inner ear system, I guess you could say, and helps with equilibrium and balance and knowing which way up and which way is down. Throughout the entire body, they have mechanical receptors or tactile receptors, which sense sensations like water movement, touch, these kind of things throughout the entire organism's body. Okay. Some other unique features within Polychaetae is they have regeneration abilities, as most individuals who are familiar with annelids, the phylum annelids. Worms can regenerate. Okay, polychaetes, that class, can also regenerate. So we're going to talk about worms specifically, not marine worms. We're going to talk about worms in a little bit, earthworms mainly. Okay. So they have regeneration abilities. They can go through asexual reproduction, so they can bud. Okay, they can go through transverse fusion. Okay, they can also do sexual reproduction. In the case of polychaetes, most are dioecious. So you're going to see that most have, there is a male and female. Okay, gametes, the sperm or egg, will be shed into a colon and then mature inside that colon. Again, one of the advances to being able to compartment your body or segment your body. When we look at this, there's other things that can go on. So the nephritum can be involved, the nephritophore can be involved. Okay, some organisms have a gonaduct. This is what's going to release the gametes, the sperm or the egg, and then external fertilization. They're aquatic worms, so external fertilization is going to occur. Now, development is unique. Remember that they're going to have spiral cleavage. Okay, so these are proteostomes. They have a trochophora larvae. But the interesting thing about the trochophora larvae is instead of going from a trochophora larvae into a juvenile phase, often you'll get this trochophora larvae that just increases the number of segments. And so it buds off in multiple segments, okay, on the posterior region and develops into a juvenile. Now, like I said before, when I first started this and introduced this topic, the annelids, some have direct development. Okay, so it goes from egg straight to juvenile. Okay, there are no trochophora larvae. And then in some cases, the spiral cleavage in trochophora larvae. So this is that budding process that I was just talking about. Trochophora larvae, and we've seen this in lots of organisms to this point. You get these ciliated bands. They can move throughout the water column. Okay, in this case, the mouth, gut, straight tube. Now, as that trochophora larvae is developing, it can develop a budding zone. Okay, so where the posterior region, where the anus is, starts to extend. Okay, and you start to get multiple segments forming. Okay, and in some cases you just have a juvenile worm. Okay, sometimes this trochophora larvae just develops into a juvenile worm, and then in some organisms it just develops from egg straight to juvenile worm, and the trochophora larvae stage is skipped. Okay. All right, so with that, that's the first group, or the first class that I want to talk about in annelids. That's the polychaetes, okay, the marine worms. Now we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and we're going to talk about the clatellates, or the earthworms and the leeches. Okay, these are organisms that have a unique structure that's used for reproduction called the clatellum. Okay, and so we're going to talk about clatellates next time.